The cold morning wind cut through Ilara's thin dress as she stood outside her small cottage, watching the Baron's tax collectors approach. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum. She knew why they were coming. She had known this day would arrive ever since her father died 3 months ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and a sick younger brother. "Ilara of Millhaven," called out the lead collector, a fat man with greedy eyes. "You owe the Baron 15 gold pieces in back taxes. Pay now or lose everything." 15 gold pieces might as well have been 1,500. Ilara had maybe 3, copper coins hidden under a loose floorboard, money she was saving to buy medicine for her brother Tobias. The boy was only 14, but a fever had left him weak and coughing. Without proper care, she feared he might not survive another harsh winter. "Please, sir," Ilara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My father just died. I need more time to find the money." The tax collector laughed, a cruel sound that made the other villagers who had gathered to watch look away in shame. "Time? Your father had plenty of time. He chose to spend money on drink instead of paying what he owed. Now his debts are yours." This was a lie, and everyone knew it. Ilara's father had worked himself to death trying to pay the Baron's ever-increasing taxes, but arguing with tax collectors was like arguing with wolves, dangerous and pointless. "I'll give you 3 days," the fat man continued. "Find the money or we take the cottage, the land, and everything in it. Maybe you can find work in the Baron's kitchen washing pots if you're lucky." The men rode away, leaving Ilara standing alone in the morning chill. Her neighbors whispered among themselves but offered no help. They had their own families to worry about, their own taxes to pay. In Millhaven, everyone was struggling to survive. Ilara walked back into her cottage where Tobias lay on a straw mattress near the small fireplace. His thin face was pale, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. When he heard her footsteps, he tried to sit up. "What did they want?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Nothing important," Ilara lied, forcing a smile. "Just checking on something. How are you feeling today?" Tobias studied her face. Despite his youth and illness, he was smart enough to read the worry in her eyes. "You don't have to protect me, sister. I heard them talking about father's debts." Ilara sat on the edge of his bed and took his thin hand in hers. "Don't worry about that. I'll figure something out. I always do." But privately, she had no idea what to do. She had already sold everything of value: her mother's silver necklace, her father's tools, even her own warm winter cloak. The cottage and the small plot of land around it were all they had left, and without them, they would both die on the streets. That evening, Ilara walked through the village looking for any kind of work. She knocked on doors, offering to clean houses, tend gardens, or help with cooking. But everyone was struggling. The harvest had been poor, and the Baron's taxes left little money for hiring help. As darkness fell, she found herself at the village tavern. The keeper, a kind woman named Beth, sometimes let Ilara work for a hot meal. Tonight, though, Beth shook her head sadly. "I'm sorry, dear. Business has been terrible. Half the village can't afford ale anymore. I can barely feed my own family." Ilara nodded and turned to leave, but Beth caught her arm. "Wait, there's something strange I should tell you. A man came by earlier asking about you specifically. Said he was a traveling merchant. Asking about me, what did he want? Wouldn't say exactly. Just asked if you were unmarried and what your situation was. I told him your father had died and left you with debts. He seemed interested. In a good way, I think. He's staying at the inn tonight if you want to talk to him." Ilara's heart sank. She could guess what kind of interest a traveling merchant might have in a desperate young woman, but she was running out of options. "What did he look like?" she asked. "Older than you, maybe 30. Walks with a bad limp, like one leg was hurt badly once. Has scars on his hands too. But he seemed respectable, well-dressed, polite, and he had money. Paid for his room with silver coins." The next morning, Ilara made her decision. She washed her face and hands carefully, braided her long brown hair, and put on her one good dress, the blue one she saved for church. Then she walked to the village inn. She found the stranger sitting alone at a table near the window, eating breakfast. Beth had described him well. He was indeed older, with dark hair starting to show gray at the temples. His left leg was stretched out stiffly, and she could see old scars across the backs of his hands. But his clothes were fine quality, and his eyes were kind when he looked up at her. "Excuse me, sir," Ilara said nervously. "I'm Ilara, the innkeeper. Said you were asking about me?" The man smiled and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please sit down, my name is Thomas. I was hoping we could talk." Ilara sat carefully, keeping her hands folded in her lap. "What did you want to discuss?" Thomas studied her face for a moment before speaking. "I heard about your situation. Your father's death, the debts you inherited. I also heard that you're caring for a sick brother." "That's true," Ilara said cautiously. "But I don't understand why that would interest a merchant." "I travel these lands regularly for my business," Thomas said. "I've seen too many good people destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. Young women forced into terrible situations because they have no other choice." Ilara felt her cheeks burn with shame. "If you're suggesting what I think you are—" "Sir, I'm not that kind of woman." Thomas held up his hand quickly. No, you misunderstand me completely. I'm talking about marriage." The word hit Ilara like a physical blow. She stared at him in shock. "Marriage? But you don't even know me." "I know enough," Thomas said calmly. "I know you've worked yourself to exhaustion trying to care for your brother and pay debts that weren't your fault. I know you've sold everything you owned and still haven't given up. I know you're brave enough to approach a stranger because you're desperate to save your family. These are the qualities I value in a person." Ilara shook her head, in confusion. "But why would you want to marry someone like me? I'm a peasant. I have nothing to offer." "You have everything to offer," Thomas said firmly. "As for why, I've been alone for a long time. My business takes me all over the region, but I have no family, no home to return to. I'm tired of being alone." "But your leg—" Ilara started, then stopped, embarrassed. Thomas smiled sadly. "You're wondering why a crippled man would be choosy about marriage? Most women see my limp and my scars and look for someone else. They assume I can't provide for a family or protect them. But I can. My merchant business does very well. I can pay off your debts, ensure your brother gets proper medical care, and give you both a comfortable life." Ilara's mind raced. It seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale. "What would you expect from me in return?" "Companionship. Honesty. A chance to build something real together. I won't lie to you. I hope that affection might grow between us over time. But I would never force anything. You would be my wife in name and law with all the protection that provides, but anything else would only happen if you wanted it to." The offer was so generous it made Ilara suspicious. "What aren't you telling me? There must be something." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "My business requires me to travel frequently, sometimes for weeks at a time. You would often be alone with your brother, and—" He hesitated. "There are things about my work that I can't discuss. Not because I'm doing anything wrong, but because my clients value their privacy." It wasn't a complete answer, but Ilara was in no position to be picky. The tax collectors would return tomorrow, and she still had no money. "If I agreed," she said slowly, "how would you pay my debts? Do you have that much money with you?" Thomas shook his head. "I would need to make arrangements through my business contacts, but I can guarantee the debts would be settled within a week of our marriage." "And my brother's medicine?" "I know a physician who travels this region. He could examine Tobias and provide proper treatment." Ilara felt tears welling up in her eyes. After months of fear and desperation, here was a solution she had never dared to hope for. But it seemed too good to be true. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Really?" Thomas reached across the table and gently touched her hand. His fingers were warm and calloused from work, but his touch was gentle. "Because I've seen too much suffering in this world," he said quietly. "Because I have the means to help, and You deserve better than what life has given you. And because I hope that maybe we can find happiness together." Ilara looked into his eyes and saw something there that convinced her. Not love, not yet, but genuine kindness and sincerity. In her heart, she knew she had no real choice. But for the first time in months, the choice didn't feel like defeat. "All right," she said. "I'll marry you." Thomas smiled, and for a moment his whole face changed, becoming younger and lighter. "Thank you, Ilara. I promise you won't regret this." 3 days later, they were married in the village church by the local priest. It was a simple ceremony with only Beth and a few other villagers as witnesses. Ilara wore her blue dress and carried wildflowers that Thomas had picked for her that morning. True to his word, Thomas had somehow arranged for her father's debts to be forgiven. The tax collectors had returned looking confused and angry, carrying a letter with Urbao. Winter came early that year, but for the first time in her life, Ilara wasn't afraid of the cold. Their cottage now had thick wool blankets, a proper supply of firewood, and enough food stored to last months. Tobias was growing stronger every day thanks to the medicines Thomas had provided, and their small home felt warm and safe. But as the weeks passed, Ilara began to notice things about her husband that didn't quite add up. It started with small things. Thomas claimed to be a simple traveling merchant, but he could read and write better than the village priest. When Ilara struggled with a letter from a distant cousin, Thomas helped her understand the complex words without hesitation. He knew about mathematics, could speak in what sounded like foreign languages, and once corrected the priest's Latin during a church service. "How does a merchant learn so much?" Ilara asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Thomas looked up from the book he was reading, another expensive item that seemed beyond a trader's means. "When you travel as much as I do, you pick things up. Different languages, different customs. Books are good companions on long journeys." It was a reasonable answer, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. Then there were the visitors. Every few weeks, men would come to their cottage asking for Thomas. They were always well-dressed, always polite, but they had the bearing of soldiers or officials rather than fellow merchants. They would speak with Thomas privately, sometimes for hours, always in voices too low for Ilara to hear. When she asked about these meetings, Thomas would smile and say they were discussing trade routes or business partnerships, but Ilara noticed that these business discussions often happened just before major announcements from the Baron's estate about new policies or tax changes. The most puzzling thing was how Thomas seemed to know about events before they happened. When the Baron announced a new road would be built through the eastern villages, Thomas had warned Ilara about it days earlier, suggesting they stock up on certain supplies that would become scarce during construction. When there were rumors of bandits in the northern forests, Thomas somehow knew exactly which paths were safe and which to avoid. "How do you always know these things?" Ilara asked after Thomas correctly predicted that the Baron would postpone the harvest tax collection. "Merchants hear everything," Thomas said, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "We have to stay informed to protect our investments." Despite her growing curiosity about Thomas's secrets, Ilara found herself becoming genuinely fond of her husband. He was kind to her in ways she had never experienced. When she was tired from household work, he would insist on helping with cooking and cleaning. When Tobias had nightmares about their father's death, Thomas would sit with the boy for hours, telling stories until he fell back asleep. Most surprisingly, Thomas treated her like her thoughts and opinions mattered. He asked what she thought about village matters, listened carefully to her answers, and sometimes even changed his own plans based on her suggestions. "Why do you care what I think?" Ilara asked one day when Thomas had asked her opinion about whether to plant winter wheat or barley in their small garden plot. "Because you're smart," Thomas said simply. "You've lived here your whole life. You understand this land and these people better than I do." The compliment made Ilara's heart flutter in a way that surprised her. She was beginning to realize that her feelings for Thomas were growing beyond gratitude and companionship into something deeper. One snowy evening in late winter, that growing affection was tested in an unexpected way. Thomas had been away for almost 2 weeks on business, and Ilara was starting to worry. He usually sent word if his trips were going to be longer than expected. She was preparing dinner when she heard shouting from the village center. Looking out her window, she saw people running and pointing toward the main road. Grabbing her cloak, she hurried outside to see what was happening. A group of the Baron's soldiers was riding hard toward the estate, their horses lathered with sweat despite the cold. Behind them came a carriage moving at dangerous speed on the icy road. Something important was happening at the Baron's manor. "What's going on?" Ilara asked Beth, who was standing with other villagers watching the commotion. "Word is the Baron collapsed during a meeting," Beth whispered. "Might be dead from what the soldiers were saying. They're bringing physicians from the capital." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. If the Baron died, everything could change. His heir was rumored to be even crueler than his father. The thought of increased taxes and harsher treatment made her stomach turn. She was about to return to her cottage when she spotted a familiar figure limping slowly down the road from the direction of the Baron's estate. Even at a distance, she recognized Thomas's distinctive walk. "Thomas," she called out, running toward him through the snow. He looked up at her approach, and she was shocked by his appearance. His face was pale and drawn with what looked like exhaustion and worry. His usually neat clothes were disheveled, and there was mud on his boots despite the frozen ground. "Ilara," he said, catching her hands in his cold ones, "you shouldn't be out in this weather. Where have you been? I was so worried. And what's this about the Baron collapsing?" Thomas glanced around nervously at the other villagers, many of whom were still watching the activity around the manor. "Let's go inside. I'll explain everything." But once they were back in their cottage with Tobias listening eagerly, Thomas's explanation was frustratingly vague. "I was conducting business near the Baron's estate when the emergency happened," he said, sitting heavily in his chair by the fire. "There was confusion, people running everywhere. I got caught up in the chaos." "But why were you near the estate?" Ilara pressed. "You said you were traveling to the western villages." "Plans changed," Thomas said shortly. "Sometimes business takes you where you don't expect to go." Ilara wanted to ask more questions, but something in Thomas's manner warned her off. He seemed genuinely upset about something, and she didn't want to add to his distress. The next few days brought more strange developments. The Baron, it turned out, hadn't died but had suffered some kind of seizure or collapse. He was alive but reportedly very weak and unable to handle his usual duties. His administrators were running the estate in his absence. What puzzled Ilara was how much these developments seemed to affect Thomas. He became withdrawn and worried, spending long hours staring into the fire or pacing their small cottage despite his injured leg. He received more visitors than usual, always speaking with them in urgent hushed tones. Then came the announcement that changed everything. 3 weeks after the Baron's collapse, riders came through the village proclaiming new policies. The harsh winter taxes were being postponed until spring. Families struggling with debt would be given additional time to pay. Most surprisingly, the Baron's administrators announced that they were reviewing all outstanding tax cases to ensure fairness. The village erupted in celebration. For the first time in years, people had hoped that they might actually survive the winter without losing their homes. But Thomas didn't seem happy about the news. If anything, he became more troubled. "Isn't this wonderful?" Ilara asked that evening, as they listened to the sounds of celebration from the village tavern. Finally, some relief for everyone. "Yes," Thomas said quietly. "It's good news. You don't sound happy about it." Thomas looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "I am happy. I just worry about whether these changes will last. Sometimes, when things seem too good to be true, they are." That night, Ilara lay awake thinking about her husband's strange behavior. The pieces didn't fit together. Thomas always seemed to know about the Baron's policies before they were announced. He had business near the estate at the exact time of the Baron's collapse. And now, when policies changed in favor of the common people, he seemed worried rather than relieved. A terrible thought began to form in her mind. What if Thomas wasn't just a merchant? What if he worked for the Baron in some capacity? What if her husband was connected to the very system that had oppressed her family for years? The idea made her feel sick. But as the days passed, more evidence accumulated. Thomas received a message delivered by one of the Baron's own couriers. He disappeared for 2 days and returned looking grim and exhausted. Most damning of all, when Ilara mentioned rumors that the Baron was recovering and might soon resume his duties, Thomas's face went completely pale. Spring came early that year, and with it came news that the Baron was indeed recovering. The gentle policies of the winter were quietly reversed. Taxes increased again, debt forgiveness programs ended, and the familiar patterns of fear and oppression returned to the village. Thomas became increasingly absent, often gone for days at a time. When he was home, he seemed distracted and troubled. He was still kind to Ilara and Tobias, but there was a distance in his manner that hadn't been there before. One warm afternoon in early spring, Ilara was working in their garden when she overheard a conversation that confirmed her worst fears. 2 of the Baron's tax collectors were riding past their cottage, talking loudly enough for her to hear. "The Baron wants a full report on the winter policies," one was saying. "He's not happy about the money that was lost during his illness." Summer arrived with news that made Ilara's blood run cold. The Baron had not only recovered fully from his winter illness, but he seemed determined to make up for what he saw as months of lost revenue. New taxes were announced weekly. Families, who had dared to hope during the winter, now faced demands for payments that were impossible to meet. The changes hit the village like a series of hammer blows. First came the grain tax. A portion of every harvest had to be given directly to the Baron's storehouse. Then the tool tax. Anyone who owned farming equipment had to pay for the privilege. Most cruelly, there was now a tax on medical care. Anyone seeking treatment from physicians or healers had to pay the Baron a fee on top of the cost of medicine. Ilara watched her neighbors sink back into the familiar despair she remembered from before her marriage. Children went hungry while their parents calculated whether they could afford both food and the taxes needed to keep their homes. The elderly stopped seeking medical help rather than burden their families with additional costs. But somehow, mysteriously, these hardships seemed to barely touch Ilara's own family. When the grain tax was announced, Thomas returned from one of his business trips with news that their small plot had been classified as merchant property and was therefore exempt. When the tool tax came, he produced official papers showing that their farming equipment was registered as business assets. Most puzzling of all, when Tobias developed a fever and needed medicine, the physician who came to treat him refused to accept payment, claiming the bill had already been settled by prior arrangement. "How do you keep managing these things?" Ilara asked Thomas one evening after learning that their cottage had somehow been excluded from a new property tax that was ruining their neighbors. Thomas was cleaning his boots by the fireplace, a task that seemed to require unusual concentration. "I told you, business relationships. When you do favors for people, they remember." "What kind of favors could you possibly do for Baron's tax officials?" "I transport things for them sometimes. Documents, goods. They appreciate reliable service." It was another reasonable-sounding answer that explained nothing. Ilara was beginning to hate those non-answers, but every time she pushed for more information, Thomas would change the subject or find urgent business that required his immediate attention. The breaking point came in late summer when a crisis struck that revealed just how deep Thomas's mysterious connections really went. It started when 7-year-old Anna, the daughter of the village baker, went missing. The child had been playing near the woods at the edge of the village when she simply vanished. Her parents searched frantically, and soon the entire village had joined the hunt. They combed the forest, dragged the creek, and questioned every traveler who had passed through recently. By the second day, Anna's mother was beside herself with grief. The village priest led prayers, but everyone feared the worst. Children didn't simply disappear without trace unless something terrible had happened. Thomas had been away on business when Anna vanished, but he returned on the second evening of the search. Ilara met him at their cottage door, exhausted from a day of searching, and sick with worry for the missing child. "They still haven't found her," Ilara said, collapsing into his arms. "Her poor mother is barely holding together." I keep thinking about Tobias when he was that age, and I can't imagine. Thomas held her tightly, but she could feel tension in his body. Tell me exactly what happened. Everything you know. Ilara recounted the details. Where Anna had been playing, who had seen her last, which areas the search parties had covered. Thomas listened with an intensity that surprised her, asking specific questions about timing and locations. I need to go out for a while, he said when she finished. Thomas, it's nearly dark. The search parties are stopping for the night. I know these woods better than most people think. Sometimes a fresh perspective helps. Before Ilara could protest, Thomas was gone, disappearing into the darkness with a speed that belied his injured leg. She waited up for him, but he didn't return that night. The next morning brought miraculous news. Anna had been found, alive and unharmed, sleeping in a cave nearly 5 miles from the village. She was dehydrated and frightened, but otherwise fine. When the search party brought her home, she had a strange story to tell. A nice man found me, Anna told her sobbing parents. He gave me water and told me to sleep. He said people would come for me in the morning. What man? Anna's father demanded. What did he look like? But Anna could only say that he had been kind and had promised her parents would find her soon. She had been too scared and tired to notice much else. Thomas returned to their cottage, just as the celebration of Anna's safe return was beginning in the village square. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he looked like he hadn't slept. But when Ilara told him the good news, his relief seemed excessive for someone who barely knew the child. Thank goodness, he said, sitting heavily in his chair. Her family must be so relieved. Where were you all night? I was worried sick. I got lost in the woods, spent the night under a tree. My leg was bothering me too much to keep walking in the dark. Another explanation that didn't quite ring true. Thomas knew the local forest better than he let on. That much was obvious from his confident hunting and gathering trips, and despite his claim of being lost, he didn't seem surprised by the news of Anna's rescue. A week later, Ilara's suspicions deepened when bandits threatened the village. A group of armed men had been robbing travelers on the main road, and word spread that they were planning to raid the village itself. The people of Millhaven lived in terror, knowing they had no real defenses against organized criminals. The village men talked bravely about fighting back, but they were farmers and craftsmen, not soldiers. The nearest baron's garrison was a day's ride away, and everyone knew the soldiers would arrive too late to help even if they could be convinced to come. Then Thomas announced he would go speak with the bandits. That's suicide, Ilara protested. They'll kill you for whatever money you're carrying. Not necessarily, Thomas said calmly. Sometimes bandits can be reasoned with. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement. What kind of arrangement? We have nothing to offer them. Let me worry about that. Despite the protests of Ilara and the other villagers, Thomas rode out alone to the bandits' camp in the hills. Ilara spent the day certain she would never see him alive again. But Thomas returned that evening with stunning news. The bandits had agreed to leave the area entirely. They would seek their fortunes elsewhere and never bother Millhaven again. Oh, did you convince them? The village priest asked in amazement. I made them understand that this region was under protection, Thomas said. Sometimes criminals don't realize who they're really dealing with. Protection from who? Ilara asked. Thomas looked uncomfortable. From people who don't like their trade routes disrupted by bandit activity. Once again, a vague answer that raised more questions than it answered. But the bandits were indeed gone, just as Thomas had promised. The village was safe. That night, as they lay in bed, Ilara finally confronted her husband directly. Thomas, I need you to tell me the truth. About who you really are and what kind of business you're really involved in. In the darkness, she heard him sigh deeply. Why do you ask? Because nothing adds up. You're too educated to be a simple merchant. You have too much money and too many connections. You know about government policies before they're announced. You can make tax problems disappear and convince bandits to leave with just a conversation. Today you talked about trade routes like you have some authority over them. Thomas was quiet for so long that Ilara thought he might not answer at all. What if I told you that some questions are dangerous to ask? He finally said. Dangerous to who? To both of us. There are things about my work that I can't discuss even with you. Not because I don't trust you, but because knowledge can be dangerous. Ilara felt a chill of fear. Are you involved in something illegal? No, Thomas said, firmly. Nothing illegal. But politics and business at certain levels can be complicated. People in power don't like their affairs discussed even by family members. People in power? Thomas, what kind of merchant has dealings with powerful people? The successful kind, Thomas said, but his voice sounded strained. Ilara, I need you to trust me. I would never do anything to hurt you or Tobias or anyone in this village. Everything I do is meant to make life better for the people I care about. Ilara wanted to believe him, but the doubts were eating at her. Then why can't you just tell me the truth? Because sometimes the truth is more dangerous than ignorance. And because... Thomas's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Because I'm afraid that if you knew everything about me, you might not want to be my wife anymore. The pain in his voice almost broke her heart. Despite all her suspicions, Ilara realized that her feelings for Thomas had grown far deeper than she had admitted to herself. The thought of losing him was terrifying, but so was the thought of being married to a man she didn't really know. I care about you, she whispered back. More than I expected to when we married. But these secrets are destroying my trust in you. I know, Thomas said sadly. And I'm sorry. I never wanted it to be this way. The morning Thomas left for his latest business trip, Ilara made the most difficult decision of her life. She was going to follow him and discover the truth, regardless of the consequences. She waited until he had been gone for an hour, then made arrangements for Beth to check on Tobias during the day. Her brother was strong enough now to care for himself for short periods, and Beth had always been kind to their family. I need to go to the next village to buy supplies, Ilara told Tobias, hating herself for the lie. I'll be back before evening. The following, Thomas proved easier than she had expected. His injured leg forced him to travel slowly, and his distinctive limp made him easy to track from a distance. Ilara stayed far enough behind to avoid being seen while keeping him in sight as he made his way along the main road. But instead of heading toward any of the villages where he usually conducted business, Thomas turned onto the private road that led directly to the Baron's estate. Ilara's heart sank as she watched her husband approach the guarded gates of the manor house. The soldiers at the entrance clearly recognized him. They stepped aside respectfully and allowed him to pass without question. This wasn't the treatment a simple merchant would receive. This was how they would greet someone important. Someone they knew well. From her hiding place in the woods overlooking the estate, Ilara watched Thomas disappear into the main building. Her worst fears were confirmed. Her husband worked directly for the Baron, and he had been lying to her about it from the beginning. But she had come this far, and she needed to know the whole truth. Carefully, she made her way closer to the estate. Buildings, staying hidden in the trees and shadows. The Baron's manor was larger than Ilara had ever imagined. She had seen it from a distance many times, but up close it was overwhelming. A massive stone structure with dozens of windows, multiple wings and elaborate gardens. It was a symbol of wealth and power that made her small cottage seem like a toy house in comparison. As she crept closer, she could hear voices coming from an open window on the ground floor. Moving carefully, she positioned herself where she could listen without being seen. The conversation inside made her blood run cold. The people are growing restless again, a voice she didn't recognize was saying. The new taxes are hitting them harder than expected. There are reports of families abandoning their farms rather than face debt prison. Good, came another voice, harsh and cruel. Let them leave. Weak people have no place in my lands. Ilara's hands began to shake. That second voice, she had heard it before during public announcements. It was the Baron himself. My lord, came a third voice, smoother and more diplomatic. Perhaps we should consider modifying the tax schedules. If too many farmers abandon their lands, we'll have no one left to work them. The taxes stay as they are, the Baron snapped. I lost enough revenue during my illness listening to soft-hearted advisors. I won't make that mistake again. Then Thomas spoke and Alara nearly gasped out loud. Father, you're being short-sighted. Father. The word hit Alara like a physical blow. Thomas had called the Baron father. I've told you before, the Baron's voice continued angrily. Your little experiment in kindness during my illness nearly bankrupted the estate. These peasants don't deserve gentleness. They understand only strength. Those policies saved lives, Thomas replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. Children stopped starving. Families stayed together. The people were actually grateful for once instead of resentful. Grateful? The Baron laughed bitterly. What do I care for their gratitude? Fear serves better than love. It always has. And where has that philosophy gotten us? Thomas shot back. Half the villages are in open revolt. Trade routes are disrupted by bandits because the people support them instead of us. We spend more on soldiers to keep order than we collect in taxes. Enough, the Baron roared. You've been spending too much time among the common people. It's made you weak. This foolish marriage of yours to that peasant girl is clearly affecting your judgment. Alara's world tilted sideways. Not only was Thomas the Baron's son, he was the Baron's heir. And the Baron knew about their marriage. My wife has nothing to do with this, Thomas said coldly. And she's worth more than any of the noble ladies you've tried to foist on me. A peasant wife, the Baron spat. It's beneath your station and an embarrassment to our family name. When I'm gone, you can set her aside and marry properly. I will never set Alara aside, Thomas said with such fierce determination that even in her shock, Alara felt her heart skip. And when I inherit, things will change. The people deserve better than fear and oppression. If you inherit, the Baron said ominously. Don't think I won't consider other options if you continue down this path. The conversation continued, but Alara could barely process the words. Her mind was reeling from the revelation. Thomas wasn't just connected to the Baron, he was the Baron's son and heir. The man she had married, the man she had grown to love, was nobility. More than that, he was destined to become the ruler whose family had oppressed hers for generations. Everything about their relationship had been built on lies. Thomas had known exactly who she was when he approached her. Not a random act of kindness, but a calculated decision by someone who already held power over her life. The debt forgiveness, the medical care for Tobias, the protection from taxes, none of it had been through mysterious business connections. It had all come from his position as the Baron's heir. Alara felt sick to her stomach. Had their entire marriage been some kind of game to him? A way to study the common people as the Baron had suggested? Had her love been nothing more than a useful tool for someone who was playing at being a peasant? She stumbled back through the woods, barely aware of where she was going. Her whole world had collapsed in the space of a few minutes. The man she had trusted, the man she had grown to love, the man who had saved her family, he was her enemy. He was everything she had been taught to fear and hate. By the time she reached her cottage, Alara was shaking with a mixture of rage, heartbreak, and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm her. Tobias took one look at her face and immediately knew something terrible had happened. Sister, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Worse than a ghost, Alara said, collapsing into a chair. I've seen the truth. She couldn't bring herself to tell Tobias what she had discovered. How could she explain that the man who had saved their lives was actually the son of the man who had nearly destroyed them? How could she make a 14-year-old boy understand that their entire life had been built on deception? That evening, when Thomas returned from his business trip, Alara was waiting for him. She had spent hours deciding what to say, how to confront him, whether to give him a chance to explain. In the end, she decided on direct confrontation. How long were you planning to keep lying to me? She asked the moment he walked through the door. Thomas stopped in the doorway, his face going pale. Alara, what do you mean? I followed you today. I heard you talking to your father. I know who you really are. For a long moment, Thomas just stood there looking like a man who had been sentenced to death. Then slowly, he closed the door and sat down across from her. "How much did you hear?" he asked quietly. "Enough. I know you're the Baron's son. I know our marriage was probably just some kind of experiment for you. I know that everything you've done for me and Tobias came from your position as nobility, not from any genuine feelings." Thomas winced as if she had slapped him. "That's not true. Not the part about my feelings anyway." "How can I believe anything you say?" Ilara demanded, her voice rising. "You've lied to me about everything from the moment we met. Your name, your background, your work. All of it was lies." "My name is Thomas," he said desperately. "Thomas Aldrich." "That part was true. And yes, I'm the Baron's son, his heir. But everything else, my feelings for you, my care for Tobias, my desire to make things better for the people, all of that is real." "Real?" Ilara laughed bitterly. "You're the son of the man who killed my father with his impossible taxes. You're the heir to the title that has kept my people in poverty and fear for generations. How can any relationship between us be real?" Thomas leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Because I'm not my father. Because everything I've learned about leadership, I've learned from you and people like you. Because marrying you was the best decision I ever made, and it changed everything I thought I knew about ruling." "Changed?" Ilara shook her head. "You mean all those gentle policies during your father's illness, those came from knowing me?" "They came from loving you," Thomas said simply. "From seeing how good people suffer under cruel laws. From understanding that there had to be a better way." Despite her anger, Ilara felt tears starting to fall. "But you deceived me. You let me believe you were something you're not. You made me fall in love with a lie." "I made you fall in love with me," Thomas said quietly. "The real me. Yes, I hid my background, but everything else was genuine. The way I treat you, the way I feel about you, the man I am when I'm with you, that's who I really am." "The man you are is a nobleman," Ilara said bitterly. "Someone who will inherit wealth and power built on the suffering of people like my family. How can you ask me to love that?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with pain. For 3 days after learning the truth about Thomas, Ilara couldn't bring herself to return to their cottage. She stayed with Beth at the tavern, helping with cooking and cleaning in exchange for a place to sleep. But even staying busy couldn't quiet the storm of emotions raging in her heart. Beth, being a wise woman who had seen many troubled marriages, didn't push for details. She simply provided a safe space for Ilara to think while keeping an eye on Tobias, who was confused and worried about why his sister had suddenly moved out. "Is Thomas sick?" the boy asked on the second day. "He looks terrible. He barely speaks, and he's not eating." Ilara's heart clenched at the description, but she forced herself to stay strong. "Thomas and I need some time apart to work through some problems." "What kind of problems?" How could she explain to a 14-year-old that their brother-in-law was actually nobility? That everything they thought they knew about their life was built on deception? "Adult problems," she said finally. "Things that are hard to understand." But even as she spoke, Ilara was beginning to realize that she didn't fully understand the situation herself. Yes, Thomas had lied about his identity. Yes, their marriage had begun under false pretenses. But the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if she was being too harsh in her judgment. After all, what would have happened if Thomas had approached her honestly from the beginning? If the Baron's son had knocked on her door and offered marriage, would she have believed his intentions were genuine? Or would she have assumed it was some cruel joke or trap? The truth was, she probably would have refused him immediately. The class divide between them was too vast, the history of oppression too painful. She never would have given him the chance to show her who he really was beneath his noble birth. On the third evening, as Ilara was cleaning tables in the tavern, everything changed. A commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the windows they could see riders approaching at high speed. Not the Baron's usual tax collectors, but soldiers in armor carrying weapons. Behind them came more men, rough-looking and clearly not official troops. Beth grabbed Ilara's arm. "Get to the back room now. This looks like trouble." But before anyone could move, the riders were at the tavern door. The leader, a man with cruel eyes and expensive clothes, pushed inside without invitation. "I'm looking for Thomas Aldrich," he announced loudly, "the pretender who thinks he can rule this barony." Ilara's blood went cold. The man's words suggested that something had happened to the Baron, and if Thomas was being called a pretender, it meant someone was challenging his right to inherit. "There's no one here by that name," Beth said bravely. "Just working folk trying to make an honest living." The man smiled nastily. "Oh, but there is. My sources tell me the Baron's bastard son has been hiding in this village, playing at being a commoner. Even married some peasant girl, I'm told. Bastard son." The words hit Ilara like a thunderbolt. Thomas wasn't just the Baron's heir, he was illegitimate. That explained so much about his father's harsh treatment, his uncertain position, his need to prove himself worthy of inheritance. "The old Baron is dead," the man continued, clearly enjoying the fear his words were causing. "Died yesterday in his sleep. And since his bastard son has chosen to live among peasants instead of claiming his birthright, I've decided to claim it for myself. Lord Garrett Blackwood, the old Baron's nephew, rightful heir to these lands." Ilara's mind raced. If the Baron was dead and this Garrett was claiming the title, where did that leave Thomas? Where did it leave the village? Her question was answered quickly. "My first act as the new Baron will be to teach these peasants the price of harboring pretenders," Garrett announced. "Every family in this village will pay a fine of 50 gold pieces for their disloyalty. Those who can't pay will lose their homes and be sold to work the mines." 50 gold pieces. It was an impossible sum. No one in the village had that kind of money. Garrett was essentially declaring that every family would lose everything they owned. "You can't do that," Beth protested. "These people have done nothing wrong. They've been living under the protection of a pretender instead of their rightful lord," Garrett said coldly. "That's treason, and treason has consequences." As if summoned by the confrontation, Thomas appeared in the tavern doorway. Ilara's heart stopped at the sight of him. He looked haggard and exhausted, but there was something different about the way he carried himself. Gone was the humble merchant's posture. This was a man ready to claim his birthright. "Garrett," Thomas said calmly, "I heard you were spreading lies about my father's death." "No lies, cousin," Garrett replied with mock politeness. "The old man is dead, and you've abdicated your claim by choosing to live in squalor with peasants. The barony is mine now." "My father named me his heir," Thomas said firmly. "Legitimately born or not, I am his son and his chosen successor. A bastard who abandons his responsibilities to play house with commoners has no claim to nobility." Garrett sneered. "Look at you, dressed like a farmer, married to peasant stock. You've made your choice." Ilara saw Thomas's jaw tighten at the insult to her, but he kept his voice level. "My marriage doesn't affect my legitimacy, and I've never abandoned my responsibilities. I've been learning how to be a better ruler than my father ever was." "Better?" Garrett laughed. "You mean weaker. Your soft policies during the old man's illness nearly bankrupted the estate. Real leadership requires strength, not sentiment. Real leadership requires understanding the people you govern," Thomas shot back. "Something you've never bothered to learn." The confrontation might have continued, but suddenly there were more sounds outside. Horses, shouting, the clash of metal. Through the windows, Ilara could see that a battle was beginning in the village square. Some of Garrett's soldiers were trying to round up villagers, while others were setting fire to houses. But they were meeting unexpected resistance. The village men, led by the blacksmith and several farmers, were fighting back with whatever weapons they could find. More surprisingly, a group of the Baron's legitimate soldiers had arrived and were fighting against Garrett's men. Apparently not everyone accepted Garrett's claim to the title. "It seems the question of succession isn't as settled as you thought," Thomas observed, watching the battle through the window. Garrett's confident expression faltered. "This changes nothing. I have the stronger claim and more supporters." Do you? Thomas asked. Because it looks to me like the people are choosing sides, and they're not choosing yours. Ilara watched in amazement as the villagers, people who had lived in fear of the Baron's authority their entire lives, willingly fought to defend Thomas's claim. They were risking everything for a man they had known only as a humble merchant with a limp. The battle was brief but decisive. Garrett's forces, caught off guard by the organized resistance, were quickly overwhelmed. The man himself, seeing his cause lost, tried to flee, but was captured by the Baron's soldiers who had remained loyal to Thomas. In the aftermath, as wounded were tended and fires extinguished, Thomas stood in the village square addressing the people who had fought for him. Ilara found herself drawn forward, unable to stay away despite her unresolved feelings. "My friends," Thomas began, and Ilara noticed he didn't say, "my subjects," or "my people." "Today you fought not just for me, but for the kind of future we can build together. A future where leadership serves the people, not the other way around." An old farmer stepped forward, a man whose son had died in debt prison the previous winter. "You're the Baron now, my lord. What does that mean for us?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and Ilara could see him thinking carefully about his words. "It means the old ways die with my father," he said finally. "No more crushing taxes, no more debt prison, no more ruling through fear. It means we work together to build something better." "Pretty words," called out another villager. "But power changes people. How do we know you won't become like your father?" Thomas looked around the square until his eyes found Ilara in the crowd. When he spoke again, his words were clearly meant for her as much as for the villagers. "Because I have people in my life who won't let me forget where I came from. People who understand what it means to suffer under bad leadership. People who care more about justice than politics." He stepped down from the makeshift platform where he had been speaking and walked directly to Ilara. The crowd parted to let him through, and suddenly they were face to face for the first time since the terrible revelation. "Ilara," he said quietly, "I know I have no right to ask this, but I need your help. Not as your Baron, but as the man you married. The man who loves you more than his own life." Ilara looked into his eyes and saw not the noble she had been taught to fear, but the gentle man who had saved her family. The man who had treated her with respect and kindness. The man who had just risked everything to protect a village full of peasants. "The people trust you," Thomas continued. "They fought for me today partly because they know you. If you stand beside me, it tells them I can be trusted to keep my word. If you walk away—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Ilara understood. Without her support, Thomas would always be seen as just another nobleman making empty promises. With it, he had a chance to truly bridge the gap between ruler and ruled. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said.